My name is Selene Adler. I was born into a family where ambition was a virtue, but only if it wore a certain kind of suit, pressed, academic, and credentialed. My father, Richard Adler, was a senior lecturer in economic theory at a liberal arts college in upstate New York. My mother, Eleanor, was the principal of a prestigious prep school, known for producing Ivy League applicants and emotionally constipated valedictorians. And my sister, Caroline? Caroline was the golden thread in our family's tapestry. A straight-A student since birth who once recited the periodic table backward just to impress a family friend from MIT. She had just been accepted into Columbia Medical School, with full scholarship, of course. The kind of win that made uncles send congratulatory fruit baskets and strangers nod with quiet approval. And then there was me. I wasn't the black sheep. Black sheep get noticed. I was the invisible one, the kid who sketched plant-based meal systems in the margins of her SAT prep book, the one who stayed quiet when Caroline talked about lab dissections over dinner, the one who coded her first website at 16, a seed exchange platform for home gardeners, and got laughed at by her cousin for wasting her time on salad. Every dinner felt like a panel interview. Caroline was always center stage. Did you know she's co-authoring a paper with a Stanford professor? Her neuroimaging scores are already ahead of first years. She's meeting someone whose uncle used to advise at Johns Hopkins. And then came the pause, and the question directed at me, always the same one. Selene, any thoughts on grad school yet? And my answer, always carefully phrased, was never enough. Because the truth was, I didn't want grad school. Not the kind they respected anyway. I wanted to build something, not in a lab, not in a courtroom. I wanted to create systems that helped people grow their own food, help farmers go digital, bring back dignity to the local. But at the Adler dinner table, there was no room for dreams that didn't fit into a fellowship application. I remember the exact moment it all broke open. It was a Thursday, late November. A soft snow had just started falling outside, and my mother had set the table with silver napkin rings in the shape of oak leaves. We were reviewing next steps, a family tradition that started when Caroline got accepted into Yale at 17. Dad had printed out a list of MBA programs he believed would realign my direction. I stared at the stack for a moment, then spoke. "I'm not applying to grad school," I said, voice steady. "I'm building a platform to help small farms sell directly to consumers. I already have the prototype, and 2 beta testers in Vermont." The silence was so sharp, it felt like a blade, sliding down the center of the table. Caroline looked at me like I had just announced I'd joined a commune. Mom blinked. Once. Slowly. And then Dad, always composed, always articulate, said flatly, "You will not waste your future on apps and dirt." That night, we didn't argue. There was no yelling, no tears, just a finality in his voice I hadn't heard before. The kind that doesn't invite debate. He stood up, placed his napkin on the table, and said, "If you're serious about this path, you can't do it from this house. We don't fund delusions." I nodded. I didn't cry. I just excused myself, walked upstairs, and began to pack. I left the next morning. A single suitcase. A beat-up Lenovo ThinkPad. A leather-bound notebook filled with garden mapping sketches. And a small mason jar with lavender seeds from the first garden I ever helped tend at summer camp. No one came downstairs to say goodbye. No warm hugs, no encouragement. Just the sound of my boots crunching the snow as I stepped out, leaving behind the house where I had grown up, but never quite belonged. As the bus pulled away from the station, I looked back one last time, not out of regret, but out of clarity. Some people leave home to chase freedom. I left because I was done asking for permission to exist on my own terms. And that, right there, was the moment I became dangerous. Not because I had all the answers, but because I was finally ready to ask my own questions. There's a certain kind of silence you only hear in someone else's apartment. It's not the kind of quiet you get from peace. It's the kind of quiet that creaks with unfamiliar floorboards and flickering light bulbs. The kind that asks you, softly but insistently, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" That's what greeted me when I opened the door to apartment 3B. An old walk-up on the edge of Burlington, Vermont, no elevator, no furniture. No one waiting for me on the other side, just me, my single suitcase, and an echo that would become the only voice I'd hear for days. The place was small, 420 square feet, if you counted the tiny balcony no one used. The heater groaned like an old man with sore knees. The windows hissed in protest every time I tried to close them. There was no desk, so I flipped over a moving box, draped a scarf over it, and called it an intentional workspace. That's what Pinterest called it anyway. The first thing I set up wasn't a bed, it was my laptop, because I hadn't left home for comfort. I left to build. I called it Farmora, a name I scribbled down in my notebook weeks before the blowout dinner. A blend of farm and aurora, because I wanted small farmers to finally see the light. Version 0. 1 was nothing glamorous. A basic Shopify-style template with clunky checkout and one lonely tab for fresh produce near you. No investors, no mentors, just me and a dream no one blessed. My first client was a tomato farmer named Claire who sold her harvest out of an honesty box on her porch. She sent me a voice note. "I don't know how to sell online, hun, but if you make it easy, I'll try." I built her a mini site in 2 days. She sold out of heirlooms the next week. I didn't tell anyone, didn't post it, didn't email my family to say, "Look, it's working." Because by then I had learned, when they don't believe in your beginning, they don't deserve front row seats to your breakthrough. I lived on canned beans, instant oats, and discount tea. Most nights, I wrapped myself in a thrifted quilt and coded until the screen blurred. I wrote platform updates by candlelight when the power went out. I reused coffee grounds twice. And when the cold crept in, not just from the cracked windows, but from my own doubts, I found comfort in the only thing that didn't question me. A blank white screen. One night in October, I got a call from my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the day I left. Her voice was stiff but familiar. "We were just wondering if maybe you've had time to rethink things." I paused. About what? About coming home, about doing something more stable, maybe grad school. I closed my eyes, felt the weight of every line of code I'd written, every dish I'd washed. Every morning I'd brewed tea before the sun rose. Then I said quietly, "I'm already home, Mom. It just doesn't look like yours." She went silent, then said, "Well, we hope you're safe," and hung up. That night, I sat on the floor and let the silence crawl into my bones. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood the truth. They weren't afraid I would fail. They were afraid I would succeed without them. 3 months after launching Farmora, I had 2 paying users. Both were local. Both needed help with more than just checkout pages. They needed clarity, trust, guidance. I wasn't just building a product. I was building a bridge, from the land to the browser. I didn't have capital, didn't have a marketing budget, but I had time, and I was willing to trade time for momentum. As long as no one tried to drag me back into a world where lavender was just a color, not a seed of healing. I stopped calling home, stopped waiting for anyone to say, "We're proud of you," because I wasn't building Farmora for applause. I was building it because I had to, because it deserved to exist, even if I didn't yet know where I did. One morning, I planted 3 lavender seeds in a cracked ceramic pot I found behind the building. I placed it on the windowsill, next to my router and my mug of cold tea, and whispered, "Grow even if no one's watching." Some mornings, I woke up not to an alarm, but to the sound of my own doubt. It wasn't loud, it didn't scream. It whispered like wind through a broken window pane. Maybe they were right. Right to dismiss you. Right to believe you, decrawl back. Right to think no one would buy into your little farmer idea. That winter was long, Vermont long. The kind of cold that makes your breath feel like glass shattering against your own lips. I kept working. Farmora was growing, but slowly, too slowly for the rent to stop blinking red in my mind. Some weeks I had $200 in my account, and every email I sent to local co-ops came back with either, "No budget," or worse, "Which university are you affiliated with?" None, just me. And a belief I wasn't sure how to measure anymore. That's when I met Leon. It wasn't dramatic. No spotlight. Just a folding chair, a lukewarm coffee, and a community workshop called Agri-Tech for Food Sovereignty. I almost didn't go. It was snowing sideways, but something in me whispered, "Go, at least pretend you're not alone for 2 hours." Leon was sitting in the back, wearing an old denim jacket with patches from a mushroom co-op in Colorado. Not tech bro, not suit and tie, just present. During the breakout session, I presented a rough sketch of Farmora's backend, an order management tool for small farms. Leon studied it quietly, then asked, "How do you handle real-time syncing in low-bandwidth areas?" I blinked. He wasn't impressed or dismissive. He was curious, like someone who knew what it meant to make things work in less than ideal soil. I told him, "Right now, I don't. I just pray the Wi-Fi holds." He smiled. "That's honest. But you could build a local cache script that holds order data offline and syncs every 6 hours." And just like that, he wasn't a stranger anymore. He was someone who spoke my language without needing subtitles. Leon was a former hardware engineer turned soil sensor consultant, working with regenerative farms on the East Coast. He believed in code the way some people believe in compost. If it's clean, quiet, and layered right, it changes everything at the root. Over the next few weeks, he stopped by my apartment a few times, always with something humble: a bag of local apples, a book on open-source logistics, or just 2 mismatched mugs and a question: "Do you want to debug together, or do you want to just sit for a while?" He didn't try to fix me. He didn't tell me I was so inspiring. He didn't ask why my family never showed up in conversation. Instead, he listened when I vented about losing a client because their cousin built a Shopify site for free. He helped redesign Farmora's dashboard layout so it worked on 3G for farmers in rural towns with barely any signal. He sat beside me at 1:30 a.m. on a Wednesday when I accidentally deleted 2 weeks' worth of order history. He didn't say, "You'll get through this." He just handed me a thermos of mint tea and opened the backup files. By spring, Farmora had signed its first mid-size partner, a 12-farm cooperative in New Hampshire. $4,800 annual contract, more than I'd made in any single month before. When I told Leon, he didn't cheer. He just pulled out a tiny box from his coat pocket. Inside was a walnut tart from the corner bakery with a sticky note taped to it: "For the day you stopped hoping they'd believe," and started becoming undeniable. I didn't cry, I just smiled, a real one this time. The kind that doesn't ask for permission to exist. That summer, we worked on Farmora V2 together. He wrote scripts. I wrote copy. He drew database flowcharts on my fridge with dry erase markers. I planted basil in the window and told him which herbs boosted memory. We didn't define it, whatever it was. But every night he left, he'd tap his knuckles gently on my doorframe and say, "Don't forget, you're not building this alone anymore." By the end of 2022, Farmora had 50 paying clients. We hired our first part-time support agent, Mila. The invoices stopped bouncing. I could finally afford to replace my cracked laptop. Leon got an offer to join a permaculture initiative in Arizona, a 2-year build. He told me he hadn't signed yet. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, standing in the doorway, thumb brushing the edge of his backpack. I looked at him for a long time, not like a lover, like someone holding a mirror I didn't flinch to look into. "I want you to go if that's what helps you grow. But if you come back, I'll still be planting." He nodded, no promises, no confessions, just 2 people learning that roots can stretch far without breaking. Before he left, he scheduled an email. It arrived in my inbox 6 months later. The subject line read, "Still building." Inside, only one sentence: "If you're still planting, I'd still like to build beside you." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I stepped out onto the fire escape, looked at the lavender still growing in the ceramic pot, and whispered, "Yes." Some invitations don't come with envelopes. They come in the form of silence. A silence so deliberate, so manicured, it might as well have been printed in gold foil. That was how I found out about my sister Caroline's wedding. Not from a card, not from a phone call, but from a Facebook post, a carefully curated photo of her in a white lace dress captioned, "Can't wait to marry my best friend." Savannah, here we come. No mention of me, no tag. No, we'd love to have you. And yet, I was already there, not as a guest, not as family, but as something far more dangerous, the unseen owner of the ground beneath their feet. Here, what they didn't know. 6 months earlier, my company Farmora had quietly acquired a boutique event logistics firm in Georgia. One of their subsidiaries managed digital infrastructure for wedding venues. I'd approved the acquisition during a morning Zoom call while sipping lemon tea and reviewing wireframes for Farmora 3.0. One of the venues we now technically supported, Magnolia Shore Estate, where my sister's wedding was about to unfold. I didn't plan it, didn't stalk them. I wasn't trying to insert myself. But when the legal document crossed my desk and I saw the venue name, I just paused, not in revenge, in realization. This world, this exact world that once called me just the girl with the herb website, now runs in part on what I built. The day of the wedding, I didn't show up in a gown. I didn't wear heels. I wore soft linen slacks, a slate blue blouse, and walked through the staff entrance, badge in hand, like any back-end consultant. No one noticed me. They hadn't in years, until they did. It happened during the reception. The sun was low, gold spilling over the Spanish moss outside. The guests were halfway through champagne when the event host, unaware of anything beyond her script, made a routine announcement into the mic. We'd like to thank Farmora Systems for providing seamless event integration today. Their team's platform kept everything running smoothly. A polite wave of claps, confused glances from some guests, not from my parents, not from Caroline. Her fork froze midair. Mom turned toward Dad, whispering something I couldn't hear. Their eyes scanned the crowd, and that's when I stepped out from behind the sound booth, not to grandstand, not to crash. I walked calmly to the side table where the AV tech sat, handed him a small USB drive and said, "Play this. No sound, just visuals." He hesitated, I nodded. He pressed the button. The slideshow appeared behind the head table. Not dramatic, not edited for effect, just screenshots. Farmora's homepage, press coverage. Client case studies from over 300 agricultural co-ops across the U.S. Photos of dashboard demos, logistics mapping, and a single headshot, mine. From a founder's weekly article. Selene Adler, the quiet architect behind America's local food tech surge. Gasps, chairs scraped. Someone dropped a glass. And still, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough on its own. I walked toward the edge of the room where my mother stood near the dessert table, visibly pale. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked her in the eyes for the first time in 4 years. Because every time I spoke, you looked past me. To the daughter you already decided was worthy of your pride. My father approached next. He was quieter than I'd ever seen him. You built this." I nodded once. "Without your approval, without your funding, without ever needing to come back and beg." Caroline, ever composed, crossed her arms. "You show up here like this on my day, just to make a point." I met her gaze without blinking. "You're marrying a man who deserves a whole heart. I hope you give it to him. But mine was broken a long time ago. Not by what you did, but by everything you stood silent for." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. I turned, walked away from the chandeliers and champagne flutes. Just before reaching the door, I paused, took one last look back, not out of longing, but to make peace with the version of me who once believed that if she just worked hard enough, they'd let her sit at the table. They didn't. So I built my own, grew the wood, forged the nails, and now, I choose who gets a seat. Some people wait their whole lives for the day their parents finally say, "We're proud of you." I stopped waiting. And on the other side of that, I found peace. After the wedding, I didn't go back to Vermont. I packed the last of my books, my plant cuttings, and the ceramic pot of lavender that had somehow survived 4 winters. And I drove south to Savannah, Georgia. I'd only visited once before. But something about the place, the moss-draped oaks, the warm earth, the soft hush of the marshes, felt like it could hold the version of me I had fought so hard to become. I bought a small white house just off a side road, one that backed onto a citrus grove and a forgotten garden choked with weeds. It took 3 days to clear the brush, 3 weeks to fix the plumbing, 3 months to breathe like I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. During the day, I worked remotely. Farmora 30 was scaling faster than we'd forecasted. We de-expanded to 12 states. Our API was being used by government-funded food access programs. I hired my 25th employee, and no, I didn't announce it, because silence, when chosen, can be sacred. At night, I tended the garden. Not for content, not for productivity, just to remember what it felt like to grow something with no demand to monetize it. And then one morning, he came back. Leon, denim jacket, quiet smile, new calluses on his hands. "I finished the Arizona build," he said simply. "And I realized the only thing I missed more than the rain was sitting across from you while you explained compost ratios." He didn't ask for space in my life. He asked if I had space in the garden. I pointed to a plot by the lavender. He nodded. "Perfect, I'll start there." In the following months, we didn't date in the traditional sense. We shared groceries, planted mint, fixed gutters, and sometimes just sat outside under the string lights, drinking tea and listening to frogs argue in the ditch. I launched the Quiet Seed Fund on a Wednesday in April, a $2 million micro-grant foundation for young founders, especially those without degrees, without pedigree, but with fire in their gut. We got 500 applications in the first 3 weeks, and on the last line of every acceptance letter, I wrote, "Grow anyway, even if no one is watching." Then came the evening. It was a Sunday, late summer. The garden was blooming again, and our long table was set for dinner: homemade sourdough, peach chutney, tomato salad still warm from the vine. Mila was in town. Jard brought wine. Ivy played an old tune on a second-hand guitar. And when dessert came, Leon stood up. No speech, no theatrics, just a small wooden box made from reclaimed fence posts. Inside, a ring carved from walnut. Smooth, simple, imperfect. He held it out and said, "Selene, I don't want to rescue you. I don't want to complete you. You are already whole. I just want to build a life next to yours. One garden bed, one rainy morning, one deep breath at a time." I didn't cry. Instead, I took off the frayed cloth bracelet I'd worn since the early Farmora days and tied it around his wrist. Then I whispered, "I don't need a ceremony to say yes. But if you ask me like that, I'll say yes for every version of me who never thought love could look like this." The table went still. Then Ivy dropped her guitar pick, and Jard shouted. Finally, everyone laughed. And I felt, not proud, not triumphant, just home. Weeks later, I received a letter, the handwriting familiar, slightly slanted. "Selene, I don't know where to begin, so I'll be direct. I was wrong. Wrong to dismiss you, wrong to try to rewrite you, wrong to measure your worth by the degrees you didn't want. You were never lost. You were just outgrowing the map we made for you. If you ever choose to let us back in, even just a little, we will come quietly." Dad, I folded the letter, placed it in the wooden box beside the ring, and I didn't reply, not out of spite, out of stillness, because I had nothing left to prove, and that was everything. Now, every Sunday night, we host a quiet dinner. No name tags, no resumes, just laughter, fresh bread, garden soil under fingernails, and ideas blooming around the table. We don't talk about success. We talk about seasons, and what it means to keep growing even when no one claps. I didn't forgive because they changed. I forgave so I could stop shrinking. I didn't say yes to Leon because I needed a fairy tale. I said yes because he saw me. Before the headlines, before the valuation, before the lavender bloomed. And now, when I look at the garden, I don't just see what I planted. I see everything I refused to abandon, myself included.